All right, welcome to the SnydeReport podcast. I am your host, Gary Snyder. Before we get to our next guest, we need to thank Robin Winston. Robin is a great sponsor of our podcast and our newsletter. Our newsletter goes out to over 100,000 daily. So make sure if you're not a subscriber there, hit us at the bottom. There should be a subscribe button somewhere down there. But joining us today is Congressman Frank Mrvan. Congressman, welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be in here and look forward to it. We want to get this out of the way really quickly. We both graduated from Ball State. So we're both chirp Cardinals. So I'm excited to be here and to be able to share that.
Now, when were you there?
So I graduated in 92.
Okay. 86 to 90.
Yeah, we overlapped a little bit.
A little. And I tell the story. I was talking with former Senator Mrvan the other day, and my first experience with politics is I got off of the elevators coming back from football practice, and Evan Bayh is waiting there at the top of the elevator in Hurlbut Hall, shaking everyone's hand, running for Secretary of State.
That is a phenomenal memory. And I had a similar memory at Ball State. There was a gentleman by the name of McDaniels who was the Republican state chair, and he was teaching a government class. Mm-hmm. And we had just gone through an election, and I think Governor Evan Bayh had just become governor, and he had Joe Hogsett on. And he had the campaign manager for whoever was running the Republican campaign. And we were in a class, and I thought it was the neatest thing ever.
Well, before we get started, we are all throughout the state. We have quite a few listeners up in the region. I've learned to call it the region.
Yes.
So why don't you take just a few minutes and just tell people about yourself that maybe don't know a lot about you, that are in the other 95% of the state.
Sure. So Frank Mrvan, from Hammond, Indiana, born and raised, went to Morton High School, met my wife, Jane, in high school. So we're high school sweethearts. Met when we were 16. I'm 56. I have two wonderful daughters, Genevieve and Scarlett, 22 years old and 18 years old, and they're the opposite sisters. One is a free spirit and will call, once every 6 months, and the other one, my 18-year-old, is dot every I, cross every T, scheduled, tracks my phone, wants to know where I am, and so it's wonderful being their father. I have a dog, Lincoln, do a lot of dog walking. And I was a township trustee for 15 years. Prior to that, I was a board member. My father was a state senator for 40 years. I did every aspect of his government relations or everything that he needed done here locally. I was his campaign manager, did those things. And it was, he loved people, loved his job, longest serving state senator in the history of Indiana. And he gave me the ability to see someone who loved people, use his skills to be able to bring people together to pass good legislation. And so on the township side, I represented one of the largest townships in the state for 15 years. It gave me a wonderful platform in order to give a voice to the voiceless, those who were impacted economically by things that were beyond their control, and to be able to promote self-sufficiency, to be able to walk people through healthcare access, to be able to utilize the hardest hit fund, to be able to utilize federally qualified health centers, to run a transportation system, and most importantly, in the community, to find a void, bring people together, or find a need, and be able to bring people together for solutions was something that I have done for 15 years.
And I don't know that a lot of people understand what a township trustee does. Their main job is to administer poor relief. And for you doing that up there for 15 years, we have to say here and applaud you for that, because that is not an easy job.
Correct. We had, we're talking a lot about doing less with more, but we did a lot more with less quite frequently. And what it allowed me to do is create partnerships with stakeholders, the faith-based communities, because people go to their churches first when they can't pay their rent or their utilities or they need help with their medicines. So we worked with the pastors and the churches and Catholic charities. We worked with social services such as the Red Cross and Salvation Army. So it built this foundation that I think makes me a better member and a stronger member of Congress because quite often you would hear people say, I never thought I'd be in this situation. And my job at that point wasn't to figure out if someone was a D or an R, it was to find solutions to get people back on their feet. And I did that for 15 years, and I thought we were very successful at doing that. The community recognized that we were there with no other agenda to be able to help people. And when Congressman Visklowski retired, I ran in fairly crowded, uh, a fairly crowded 14-person primary, and we were successful. And this is my third term, currently on Appropriations Committee, which is a select committee which I believe not only benefits Northwest Indiana, but the state of Indiana as far as delivering resources for our state.
Now, people always say, not this people, but people always say you never want to follow the greats. You didn't want to follow Bear Bryant. You didn't want to follow Newt Rockne. You didn't want to follow John Wooden. And here you are following one of the greats of Indiana in the first district. How has that adjustment been?
I guess you are your life experiences, right? As I mentioned, when my father was a state senator and I ran for the board at a young age of 30 years old, I had a self-imposed kind of pressure that I placed upon myself that I wasn't just the last name that won an election in a pick three board race. I had to prove myself. And then when I became the township trustee 3 years later, I had a chip on my shoulder to be able to prove that I deserve the job and to be able to use my skills and talents to help people and allow people to become self-sufficient and to be able to connect people with jobs and to reduce addiction and be creative. And I think as a member of Congress, it gives me that motivation. I, of course, am inspired by my mentor, Congressman Visklowski, and what he's achieved as becoming chairman of defense, and also being a champion of the steel industry here in Northwest Indiana in all trades and union labors, and making sure we create work and wealth. So absorbing those lessons that I have gotten from him as I did my father, and working extremely hard along with staff to be able to develop relationships in Washington, D.C. that are productive for the region, Northwest Indiana, the state of Indiana, our nation, is my mission. And so, to answer your question directly, when you follow someone great, all you can do is every day do your very best and try and make a difference for your constituents.
You were elected in 2020. We had President Biden coming in. So you spent your first 2 terms with President Biden. Now we have President Trump. You gave a great speech on the floor talking about why you were against the continuing resolution to fund the government. Talk to us a little bit about that. And how disappointing was it when Congress was standing up and opposing the Senate just to sell out like they did?
Well, I don't judge the Senate at all. What I mean by that is my choice and why I made my decision was the continuing resolution bypasses the authority of the power of the purse for Congress. Article 1 within the Constitution clearly defines that the appropriations process is a authority of Congress. And when you are operating on a continuing resolution, which our fiscal year ends October 1st, for almost a year, what that is going to do is one, the Appropriations Committee in the House and the Senate, led by the majority, are bending a knee to the current president and saying, here, do what you want. It also allows the president and DOGE to have the ability to act even more freely because we haven't passed a law telling what are essential services. So the bottom line is why I voted no is because I believe in a checks and balance system that goes through appropriations and you negotiate. I find it non-negotiable when we're talking about Medicaid cuts that are absolutely on the table because they have to get $880 billion out of commerce and energy up to $1.4 trillion. And there's only one place they can get that from, Medicaid. So what does that mean, right? Because those numbers don't resonate with people. What that means is, and going back to giving a voice to the voiceless as I was a township trustee, there are 200,000 people within my district who aren't going to have health care coverage. So let me break that down a little bit more. Senior citizens, people who are out of work, children with complex medical conditions, senior citizens who are in nursing homes or memory care units who have sold all their assets and now are in a nursing home. These are all different payment programs that are at risk. So 200,000 folks are no longer going to have access to health care. So let's look at what that means big picture. So what that means big picture is if you have, for the state of Indiana, which is a trigger state, not to get too complicated, meaning that they're one of 7 or one of 9 states in the country that if there is a disruption to federal funding, then they let go all of the Medicaid funding in the program together. So everyone who's on HIP or HIP 2.0, who's your insurance plan, who are receiving Medicaid coverage, that will end. And so parents with children who have autism, that's Medicaid that they're able to use for their therapy, for nonverbals, for the ability to de-escalate. All of those things that are helping people at the very minimum are at risk. And so what that means to our everyone is a stakeholder is if people are no longer covered, and then we go back to the formula of people going to the emergency room when there's an issue and they can't afford health care, then we need to understand that what the next step is the hospitals are going to do something with private pay that will increase insurance. So it will affect not only access to health care, it affects those lives that I've talked about, children, seniors, and those that are the voiceless in this fight. And then it also, in fact, impacts people who have private insurance. And so I think that it's important that we draw the line and make a stand on certain issues. Also within that bill, where is non-negotiable for me, is they cut $23 billion out of the Honor the Pact Act. So veterans who had exposures to toxic burn pits, to radiation, to Agent Orange, this bill was life-changing for veterans.
It was.
It allowed them to have access to health care without having to prove that the fire pits caused cancer, the fire pits caused blood disease, the fire pits caused asthma, heart conditions. Same with Agent Orange, same with radiation. And so over 1 million veterans took advantage of that. I know in Lake County and throughout the state of Indiana, 60 or 70,000 new individuals became eligible, and it increased numerous people of military connected disability, service connected disability, where it increased their percentage. And through this bill, if a member, a man or woman who served our nation got to 100%, then their spouse was covered also, fulfilling the promise of saying, if you serve our nation, if you leave our family and go risk your life for our freedom, then we will provide you health care. We're defunding that. And this, I'm not an alarmist. I'm just giving you the facts.
Right.
And so that is where I drew the line. So I voted no simply for the protection of Medicaid, for the protection of our veterans, and in a regional, right? I'm district centric. For a regional effort, we had $4 million going to police departments for technology, for cameras, which was a force multiplier for our police departments, meaning that as the number of police and men and women shrink about being in the community or in the field, we're using cameras, we're using shot spotters. I worked with municipalities throughout Northwest Indiana to receive funding so that we can use technology and have a force multiplier. We also did that on an economic development area for Northwest Indiana in creating work and wealth. So that is why I voted no. And being on the appropriations committee, being very protective of that power of the purse, Article 1, because that is a checks and balance. And that is where negotiation should begin so that we could have a bipartisan effort. And like I said, I believe that access to health care isn't a DNR kind of situation, along with community safety. And that's why I voted no, and we'll look to make sure that we restore that funding for my community and protect Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and our veterans' health care.
What do you think the purpose of DOGE is? What do you think they are trying to accomplish?
Well, I think it's important for me to be able to articulate. I have a dog, Lincoln, and every time Lincoln goes outside, if he sees a squirrel, he gets distracted and he looks at the squirrel. I believe that I think that everyone wants to eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse to make sure that the dollars, the federal tax dollars, are going to where we need it most to be able to help people. And what I believe is going on is there's a distraction because these blanket cuts aren't being well thought out. And when we talk, as I talked about healthcare, what people need to understand is the basic formula because they're telling you what they're going to do. They are going to implement the past administration's tax cuts that will sunset in August. In order to do that, they have to fulfill a promise to the Freedom Caucus to be able to cut spending in order to accomplish that. So what they're doing is they're cutting spending to be able to afford their tax cuts to uh, the wealthiest within our country and our biggest corporations. When that is accomplished, there'll be, but when that gets accomplished, the end game, what we have to understand is it still adds to the deficit.
Mhm.
So they're paying down on short term some of the deficit, but long term with those tax cuts, it will add to it. The latest tax cuts added $8 trillion to our deficit, eight with a T. And so we have to be very cognizant of the fact that uh, these cuts have a purpose to which will impact real people's lives to make sure that we transfer those funds to tax cuts to people who need it the least.
Right. When when you take a look and you talked about the PACT Act a little bit and you talk about veterans, how concerning is it for you and your district when they want to cut 80,000 jobs from the VA? How does Congressman Mrvan and the Democrats in Congress stop something like that when you're not in the majority?
Crystal clear. I guess the lesson that I learned from my father, who was in the minority in the United States Senate, is very clear. You use every tool necessary. And so I think that it's important for independent agencies to be able to utilize the courts to see, uh, to make sure that it's constitutional what they're doing and they're not bypassing Congress and letting people go. I think that, let's define what that means when you're letting 80,000 employees go from the VA. That means that Jesse Brown in Chicago or in Indianapolis, the VA center has less people processing claims. It has less people being able to provide services. It has less people answering the phone for suicide hotlines. And again, we're going back to fulfilling the promise of making sure when veterans, men and women, risk their lives, that we are committed to them to fulfilling the promise that they have access to health care, that they have access to employment opportunities, that they have access to mental health, that they have access to the GI Bill in a timely fashion. And so I am and served on the Veteran Affairs Committee for 4 years. I absolutely know that there are efficiencies that need to be made. But again, blanket cuts without a plan impact real people's lives. And I stand with the veterans who are now taking note and saying, hey, this isn't what we signed up for. We want to make sure that we have health care, we have mental health, we have a suicide prevention line where people are answering the phone, and we have people filing our claims for the GI Bills.
You are in one of the largest steel producing districts in the country. We have a lot of blowback with tariffs right now, with Canada, with Europe, with Mexico. How do those tariffs affect the region and your district?
So absolutely. I want to first say that I'm very proud. My grandfather came over from Czechoslovakia and he moved to East Chicago in the harbor, and he worked at Inland Steel for 56 years. He was a steel worker.
Wow.
And my father was very supportive of the steel workers, the trades. It is an economic engine where tens of thousands of people have worked and are currently working throughout, not only in the steel industry and the steel workers, but the trades that service those steel mills, and the contractors, union and non-union, who work is dependent upon the industry. So I am the co-chair or the vice chair of the Steel Caucus, along with Representative Crawford, which is 100 members in a bipartisan way that protects and also wants to make sure that the steel industry thrives. We have advocated for the Section 232 steel tariffs that protects against bad actors such as China, that will subsidize their steel, which means, to put that very simply, a steel mill in China, either the labor will be subsidized or the energy costs will be subsidized. So it's in the market and it's at an unfair price because the government is subsidizing it so they could dump steel in the market, lower the price. And when that happens and you circumvent our trade laws, then people start losing their jobs here in the United States. So to your question, I wanted to set the table on where I stand. So blanket tariffs, I am fearful and am anxious, just like the rest of the country, as people's 401ks were dropping because of the uncertainty of the tariffs. I am very worried about blanket tariffs and how it impacts the manufacturing of automobiles, the manufacturing of refrigerators, the manufacturing of appliances. And so there are good trade partners that we have to be very, very cognizant of in the global economic markets to make sure that we aren't disruptive of our supply chain. Because what I have learned, and I think what COVID taught us, is when you have a disruption to the supply chain during these tariffs, you have to allow industry to be able to adjust. If there is a stoppage of a product that is used in an automobile, and the manufacturer doesn't have an opportunity to look, and then I am all for domestic manufacturing here in the United States,
Right.
to make sure that we can produce it and create manufacturing jobs here to be able to make that product. I'm all for that. But what we have to be very aware of is these blanket tariffs that are potentially disrupting the supply chains. And I believe whatever we can do to protect domestic manufacturing is vitally important, but we can't use the word disruption and allow that to equal job loss. We could do things in a manner that is strategically planned out so that there isn't job loss in the process.
Two more questions for you, then we'll let you get back to your busy schedule. Number one, for people that are out there concerned, whether it's the president ignoring courts, whether it's tariffs, whether it's job cuts, what is your message to your constituents, to Hoosiers, to people watching this podcast, to give them some reassurance that Democrats understand and Democrats will fight what's happening?
Well, I think that my message is as clear as possible, is that we will make sure we stand up for principles, but yet, in my view, I can never give up my principles for working men and women, for veteran benefits, for safe communities, for a safe nation. Now that I'm on appropriations, making sure that we are properly funding our energy programs, to make sure I'm on energy and water, protecting from commerce, justice, and science. I'm on that subcommittee, making sure that we have safe communities and access to federal funds that allow us to do that here in Northwest Indiana and the state of Indiana. So my message is we can do things. We can still cut budgets, but we don't have to be cruel. We don't have to be able to kick people off of Medicaid. We don't have to make sure people don't have access to health care. And that ultimately people are unprepared for what is to come from the ramifications of that. And what we are currently doing is what I am doing as a member of Congress, is making sure I use my voice to be heard. making sure that we are standing up in committee and legislatively where we feel that these cuts are going to be harmful, such as to Social Security, that people have paid into it. I want to protect against the privatization of Social Security. And the courts obviously aren't moving fast enough for people who are anxious. And I think that we have to, for the favorability of our nation, look at legislation on what might happen if the executive does not follow through on a Supreme Court order. What are the ramifications of that? And so, as we examine those types of pieces of legislation and what we can do going forward, let's just collectively use our voice, share the stories, so that we can use the power of the people, and hopefully we can collectively come together and find common ground, because that is the ultimate goal within our nation, within the state of Indiana, and within my district, is to find common ground, but not give up our principles when it comes to working men and women having the right to collectively bargain, to find a good job, to have good health care, to be able to fulfill the promise of the American dream, and to be able to send their kids to college. Those are all things worth fighting for and advocating for. And ultimately, what we need to do as Democrats is make sure that we're talking about work and wealth. We're talking about preserving healthcare access, preserving Social Security, and getting back to the basics of understanding people who are working in our nation are better off. And people want to be collectively together and not divided.
Last question for you. You're in the first district. It was redrawn a little bit. You are what they consider a frontline candidate. It's one that Republicans always shoot for. They throw, quote unquote, their best candidate at you term after term. I compare it a little bit to the fifth for Republicans. You always think you're going to win it, but it always ends up in Republican hands. How has that made you a better candidate and a better congressman?
That's a great question. I think, very simply put, is that I have to be a good listener to my district. I have to stay connected to my district. I have to be able to have conversations that may make me uncomfortable, but I also have to seek out common ground. And so, with that competitiveness comes an awareness of what it means throughout our nation in districts that are equally divided, and what it means to come together and to be able to look at legislation from all different avenues to find out where there's common ground and where it violates my principles of what I believe as a Democrat. And so it makes me a better member of Congress, because I have to be acutely aware of every piece of legislation, the ramifications of it, but more importantly, where there are threads of common ground, and if those are things I can live with based on what my district wants and needs.
Perfect. Anything that you wanted to cover that maybe I did not have the foresight to ask you?
I don't think so, not at this time. I just want to thank you. Had mentioned Robin Winston, and I want to thank you for taking the time to create this platform, and for you and your wife. I know Pepper every so often is on the show, but
Yep.
ultimately, I just want to close with saying that to all Democrats and all constituents in my region, I'm honored to serve as your member of Congress. And I think it is imperative for people to understand that I believe in finding common ground. I believe in the checks and balances. I'm honored to be on appropriations, to be able to deliver for Northwest Indiana good projects, work and wealth, and the state of Indiana. And I will continue to do that, and I will work in a bipartisan way with the current infrastructure of the two United States senators, Governor Braun and his administration, local elected officials from both sides of the party, and state officials, so that we can do what's best and create jobs, and create jobs that have good health care, future jobs for future generations, and focus on an educational system that produces people that are capable of doing those jobs that we're trying to create.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Before we let you go, we do need to thank Robin Winston again, great sponsor of the podcast and our newsletter. Somewhere right down here, there's a subscribe button. Slam that, and make sure you get our podcasts when they come out. I'm Gary Snyder. He's not. He's Congressman Frank Mrvan, and you're listening to the SnydeReport podcast.